Our next presentation is by Chris Turner, and he was going to talk to us a little bit about transitioning food environments, transitioning livelihoods, a qualitative investigation of food acquisition practices from 2 rapidly urbanizing villages in peri-urban Hyderabad, India.
So my name's Chris, and as I just mentioned, I'm going to be presenting this qualitative investigation of food acquisition practices from peri-urban Hyderabad. So this study has 3 main aims. The first was to investigate drivers of food acquisition in a peri-urban setting. The second was to understand perceptions and experiences of change in the food environment and food acquisition practices over the past decade. And the third was to explore intra-household dynamics in relation to food acquisition, preparation, and consumption. So this study is situated within the Andhra Pradesh Children and Parents Study, and this features 28 sites just south of Hyderabad, as you can see on the map here. And we purposely selected 2 villages, Patalguda, which features a high level of urbanicity, and Tumalur, which features a low level of urbanicity. And the aim was to capture a range of peri-urban environments in this setting. And so we randomly sampled 10 households from each village, which is a total of 20 households. And we used a convenience sampling method to select 1 male and female from each household, so we had a total of 40 participants. And so our methods, we randomly assigned households to one of 2 methods. The first was in-depth interviews, of which there are 18, and the second was qualitative GIS approach, of which there were 22. And so the QGIS approach featured participative photo mapping, where participants photographed their food environment over 3 days using a GPS-enabled smartphone. And photos were mapped and printed onto chart paper, and then the charts were used in follow-up interviews featuring graphic elicitation and photo elicitation techniques to elicit narratives about drivers of food acquisition from an emic perspective. And here you can see an example of one of the QGIS interviews taking place. So here's the guiding information that we provided on the home screen of the mobile phone devices. As you can see, we asked participants, how does food fit into your daily life and activities? We asked them to take pictures of buying, growing, preparing, cooking, and eating food, as well as any food sources, but also non-food items or objects or activities that they thought were important in shaping the foods that they would eat. So for the analysis, we used NVivo 12 software to code the data set, and we used thematic analysis, which included deductive and inductive techniques, and we used an iterative process here, and we coded the data using the dimensions from the food environment framework, which you can see on the screen at the moment. And we also used in vivo coding as a way to identify new or additional themes or dimensions, and this approach allowed us to sensitize, qualitatively sensitize and validate these key concepts and dimensions. So quickly onto some results. Here we have an example of a QGIS chart from the pilot testing. As you can see, the map's in the center with the data points from where the photographs were taken, and then the photographs are displayed around the edge with corresponding numbers. Here's an example of one of the photographs that from one of our phones. As you can see, the cameras were able to work in a range of conditions. I will make a quick mention about ethics. So actually all of the photos and maps from the participants are actually confidential. But the photos in this presentation were taken by myself or by the field team, and they're indicative of the setting and the photos that were taken by the participants. Although I would like to stress that I'm no Peter Menzel, but I did try my best. So we found that participants navigated diverse food sources as part of daily life. This included market-based sources such as mandal headquarters, villages, and urban areas. It also included agricultural production in the form of own production, farm gates of local producers, and home gardens. It also included wild harvested foods such as seasonal fruits, and also transfers from ration shops, payment for labor, and also gifts from neighbors or relatives. Most participants described weekly shopping patterns at their mandal headquarters, and these trips were interspersed with what were known as emergency or habitual food purchases from local village vendors as and when needed. So here you can see I've put up a slide here where we have the photographs which were taken, and we've coded them according to the food source. So participants, they took over 1,000 photographs, which was an average of 43 per person. And 267 of these, the ones that were considered to be the favorites by the participants, they were mapped, printed, and coded. So that's an average of 11 per person. And 55% of them were actually mapped, included food sources, which is what you can see here. So the most common was agricultural production, followed by informal market-based vendors, formal market-based vendors, and then finally wild food harvesting. So on to some preliminary results of drivers of food acquisition practices. From the external food environment domain, prices was considered to be a key driver amongst many participants, and this is similar to findings from other drivers of food choices presented earlier this week. Mandal headquarters were a key source of food sold at relatively lower prices when compared to the villages themselves. And there was also some evidence of purchasing lower quality leftover vegetables in the days following weekly markets due to the reduced price of these items. And this seems to suggest that price may take precedence over freshness and quality, at least for some participants. Having said that, the quality of freshness of perishable items, such as fruits or vegetables, was considered to be a key driver amongst the majority of participants, although perceptions were varied according to the food source and also the different vendor types. So vendors that were perceived to provide fresh quality produce included the farm gate of local producers, where vegetables were considered to be cut in the morning and sold in the evening, the weekly village markets, Mandal headquarter markets, and also urban areas where stock turnover was quite high, and this was particularly the case for fruits. Another key driver of food acquisition practices was food safety. It's perhaps a little bit different from some of the findings presented earlier this week from other places, but here adulteration and contamination of foods was a primary concern, and participants identified risks at the point of production, transformation, and also sale. And market-based vendors and outside foods, they were commonly linked with unknown levels of food safety, as you can see from these quotes here. So participants considered that wholesale shops and vendors, they didn't actually know what was in the bags, whether it was plastic rice or normal rice. Plastic rice was a key concern amongst the participants. And then in the second quote here, you can also see from informal roadside vendors concerns around flies and dust and things like that. So one new in vivo theme that came from the data was a sense of community and trust. And sentiments of trust related to known people, they were embedded throughout the participants' accounts. And they were closely connected with practices of acquiring food on credit, as well as freshness, quality, and food safety discourse that I've already mentioned. And this highlights the importance of social contracts in food acquisition practices. As you can see here, the first quote, they're talking about known people and how they go with trust, particularly in relation to food credit. And also in the second quote here, this person was actually a non-farmer, but he considered the fields to be our fields or our own fields, suggesting some kind of connection to the local environment and their land. So quickly on to perceptions of change over the past decade. Participants identified increasing availability of consumption of outside foods, and this was linked to transitioning livelihood strategies, the sale of agricultural land, and also more urban ways of life. There was overwhelming consensus around price increases, and there was increasing levels of adulteration, was again identified as a key change over the last decade, with participants making links to both diet and health. As you can see here, participants mentioned that they were now using chemicals and what they call drugs to produce more yields in the fields, but that it wouldn't be nutritious, and it's actually become like what they called ready-made rice. Accessibility was also considered to have increased with the use of personalized modes of transport, and this has facilitated weekly acquisition practices, as well as roadside purchases on the way to and from work in urban areas, particularly amongst men. I think this is some kind of world record attempt for the amount of food you can get on one motorbike. And convenience was also perceived to have increased with the transition from traditional wood-burning stoves to LPG gas burners, so they can now cook quickly and they can run for work. However, this was linked to perceived reduction in taste and also concerns about health implications. So finally, on to intra-household dynamics. In terms of gender, the maps in the transcripts suggested some tentative evidence of gendered activity spaces in relation to food acquisition. Men tended to travel further afield as part of their daily activities, whilst many women remained within the village, and some even within the household itself. We had some cases of some women saying that they only actually went into the village once every 2 to 3 months. However, there was some evidence to suggest this is changing, as you can see from the last two quotes here. However, fundamentally, women were found to be critical decision makers within the households, and they were solely responsible for their food preparation and cooking. This included women of working age, but also elders. And women who did participate in food acquisition tended to be responsible for vegetables and grocery shopping, whilst we found a tendency for men to be responsible for the purchase of meat. The last slide now onto children's diets, and children and younger generations found fast foods and outside foods to be more acceptable and desirable than their older generations. The practice of sending children to local shops was quite common, and we found evidence of children pestering their mothers for fast foods and snacks and sweets. There was also influence of peers amongst children and neighbours and households within the village, and also some evidence of overweight being perceived as desirable, and this was also mentioned in the Drivers of Food Choice session earlier in the week. As you can see in the last quote, this father actually bought cakes because he thought it would be glamorous if the children were actually fat from eating cakes. So that's something to think about. So I'd like to finish by saying thank you to the field team, some of them who are here today, and also the partners at NIN and the funders of my PhD, Imana and LSHTM.